Justin, Sakigake, Julius, and Ramon. These four characters have one thing in common, and that is suffering a definitive loss in the Real Champions Tournament. These losses are so severe that people are actually questioning why these characters were included in this tournament and not others. And today we're going to be talking about that specifically. In fact, this video is going to be broken down into two sections. One, the canon reasons as to why the roster was what the roster was. But secondly, looking at the Real Champions Tournament in comparison to the other tournaments in the Kengan world. And I think you'll find out something very interesting when I look at this, or at least it will put things into a bit more perspective, let's say. And so let's start off with the canon reasons why the roster was the way it was. And we'll start off with the most important piece of the information here, and one that I think everyone might have forgotten about. This piece of information is at chapter 160 of Kengan Omega, and this is before the Berserker Bowl tournament was underway. So you had people like Koga, Ryuki that were going to join, they had their whole bracket thing going on, but before all of that, we had a little piece of dialogue from Sakigake, and this is very important because Sakigake said he was going to sit out the Berserker Bowl tournament. And the reason he was gonna do that is because there was a rumored Kengan Annihilation tournament happening. And so even some of the fighters from Purgatory, at least the top fighters from Purgatory, were also sort of going to the sidelines until this Annihilation tournament was happening. And keep in mind, the Annihilation tournament has not happened yet, so people are probably still conserving their strength, especially organizations that have, you know, certain fighters that they are depending on. So in the case of, let's say, Nogi, right? Nogi would probably want Hatsumi to defend his throne since he is currently the chairman or the leader, big guy, of the Kengan Association. The same would be for, let's say, Wakatsuki as well, because I think Wakatsuki is also affiliated with a specific organization as well, that the powers that be that, you know, Wakatsuki fights for would be like, hey look, Annihilation tournament might be happening any day now, just sit this one out, you can go train in, you know, wherever you want to do. And that's exactly what Sakigake was doing as well. And so that narrows down a lot of fighters, right? Because that means that the fighters that participate in tournaments before the Annihilation tournament are either A, rogue fighters, so they fight for different organizations and they're not exactly tethered down to specific organizations. Example, Agito and Gerada. I think they don't fight for specific organizations anymore. Like, Agito is not, you know, the Fang of Metsudo for Metsudo anymore, right? He just has the former title of the Fifth Fang. And Gerada has been moving from like Purgatory to the Kengan Association, so he's just going around doing his thing. But unless you're a rogue fighter, you are taking a risk in terms of putting yourself out there, which some organizations may not want to take. But that does bring us over to the other question that you could probably have at this point, and that is why other characters didn't transfer over to other organizations, you know, because Julius and Gao Lang managed to do that no problem, right? Because there are a lot more rogue-ish fighters out there that were willing to participate in the tournament. So like Carlos and Toku expressed that they wanted to be in this tournament as well. So why wasn't that possible? And this is something that I don't think people have paid attention to, as well as to why Julius and Gao Lang's transfer even works. Because in chapter 267, I think it is, we actually get a reason as to why this was even possible. Because D4, the underground fighting promotion that Julius transferred over, and Garo, the underground fighting promotion that Gao Lang transferred over to, are both owned by Toyota. Now, Toyota is part of the Kengan Association as well, although of course he earns Purgatory and these other two fighting promotions. And so there's literally a direct line, a direct connection that Gao Lang and Julius could have possibly used to be like, hey, Toyota, you know who we are, you know, it is what it is, hook us up with this underground fighting promotion, and Toyota would be like, sure, you know what, why not? He already knows these people and their MO. Hence the reason why, even though they're in these underground fighting promotions, they're still enlisted in the Kengan Association. Yamashita confirms as much. But something like that, unfortunately, is not possible with, I say, Dragons, Underground 1, I think is where Justin is from, and from Slaughter Coliseum. There isn't really that connection, that Toyota connection that could place these other fighters in these positions. In fact, that's why Yamashita was confused about Sakigake's inclusion into the tournament. But we know why he was included in the tournament, because he has a special connection to the person who owns the Ice Age Dragons Underground Fighting promotion. It's literally his biological father. And so outside of underground fighting promotions that are connected to Purgatory and the Kengan Association, no other underground fighting promotions are incentivized to just change over their champions like that for a fighter that they know nothing about, probably has no interest in fighting in their promotion, and just wants to use them to get inside the tournament. It's very unlikely that this would actually work out, is what I'm saying here, because the conditions for how Gao Lang and Julius made it work don't exist for the other underground fighting promotions. Which is why, coincidentally, those 3 underground fighting promotions have newer characters in their respective champion positions, basically. And so let's transition over, right now that we have the canon, answers, now that I've gone through them, let's talk about the quality of the Real Champions tournament. And what I mean by quality, right, is we are looking at characters that, are masters at their own craft, you could say. Characters where Kuroki Gensai is like, yeah, this character is a master like me, Jurata, talking about Jurata specifically in the Kengan Association versus the Purgatory competition here. Fighters of that caliber getting involved in a tournament and fighting against each other is relatively rare. Remember, when Agito versus Jurata happened, Wakatsuki was like, we haven't had a match this big since, the Kengan Association versus Purgatory. That entire competition. And in fact, I would say that it's even more rare than that. Because if you go back to Kengan Ashura, the only character that was as strong as Kuroki Gensai in that tournament was Agito. And so it just so happens that the highest level of what fighters were capable of in Kengan Ashura, right, only happened once between Agito and Kuroki. That isn't to say there weren't any high-tier fights or they weren't any good fights. I'm just talking about the level of the fight itself. Because there were a lot of fights in the Annihilation tournament, and I can only point to that one being the highest level, and no other fight compares to it. Even if you could say certain other fights are written better, right? That doesn't really change the caliber of the characters involved. If we go to the Kengan Association versus Purgatory again, even though there were multiple characters of this caliber in this tournament, so at this point, Ryan, Oma, Agito, you had Lo Long, you had Jurata, you had Fei Wangfang as well, you could add them in there. Even though they were there, they seem to have had mismatches where they didn't fight someone who was of the same caliber as them. The only exception is Oma versus Lo Long, the finals of that tournament, where the caliber was also high, but they were also somewhat evenly matched, right? It's just a matter of what happened in the fight itself that is a matter of discussion. But that means that we have really only had, and this is really crazy to say, within a tournament, we've really only had two of these fights of, the highest caliber possible. The fighters are just these high tier characters and they're fighting against a character of a similar caliber. Only really 2. Compare that to the Real Champions tournament that has a smaller roster, but we've already had 2 of these types of fights. Gao Lang versus Jurata, which were high caliber fighters that were pinned against one another, and the current fight that we're having now between Agito versus Lo Long. 2 already. That's excluding the finals, which will make it 3. Which would make the Real Champions Tournament the highest caliber tournament we've had in the series. Like, easily. Already. It doesn't necessarily mean that the fights itself are written well, right? You could have issues with the writing of certain fights. I'm not in the dispute of that, right? I know in the Annihilation Tournament, Agito's power level wasn't even consistent, so he had fights that were seemingly tougher, like for example, his fight against Gao Lang, right? But this points to a much bigger, element here, and that is that these fights are really rare. And the reason they were rare is because there were few of these fighters, right? I think that if you had put Sekabayashi in Julius's position, he would have suffered this similar type of loss. In fact, you would have to put characters that we know Oma's training, we know Kuroki's training, Ryan is having to fight, the Westwood faction. He's in the middle of a war. But unless you have people that are that powerful joining the tournament, so for example, maybe Ray is that powerful, right? But we don't exactly know that. We would need a display. But let's say for the sake of argument, you would need to put someone of his caliber there. Otherwise, really the outcome doesn't change. It would just be like how his fight with Kuroki went down, really. Possibly even worse. But that's typically what happens when fighters of a lower tier fight this caliber of fighters. They tend to lose more definitively. That's just the thing. Again, referencing the Ray situation and his fight against Kuroki. Ray was relatively fast in Kengan Ashura. He's the fastest character there. Some people would say he is still technically the fastest, but he really couldn't do much of anything against Kuroki because he was just that caliber, right? And Kuroki had a relatively fine performance in terms of how much damage he was taking against his respective opponents until his fight with Agito. And even in the finals against Oma couldn't do anything. And when you have characters like Oma, Ryan, and Agito of a similar level, I think people are too hard on characters like Julius, Sakigake, Ramon, and not Sakigake, he lost to Ramon, right? But Ramon's loss to Lo Long isn't really that big of a surprise. Julius is also not a big surprise because that's what typically happens. But yeah, that is the video. Thank you if you made it this far, because yeah, a lot of this was unscripted. I just had like rough notes. But yeah, until next time, take it easy.